Hello, everyone. I'm Robbie Swale, and this is the 12-Minute Method podcast. And in this podcast, I'm going to be investigating how we can beat procrastination, be more productive, and finally do those things we have been meaning to do. And in season 1, what that means is I'm going to be reflecting on a number of things that I mostly first wrote about together in one place in the About the Author section of the 12-Minute Method books, in book 1 in particular. These are things that over my life I have procrastinated on, thought I might not get done, and then finally done in the end. And in each episode, I'll spend up to 12 minutes reflecting on one of those things and sharing those reflections with you, hoping to identify patterns, things that you can use, ways that you can finally do the things that you've been meaning to do. Hello, welcome to episode 8, and despite promises next time, that was an incorrect promise. This is not an episode about books. That'll be in a couple of episodes' time. Today, I'm actually going to talk about exercise. I realized just the other day, I was being interviewed for a podcast. I think it was Craig Constantine on the Podcasters Community podcast. You can find that on the 100 Podcasts challenge page on my website. It's an article that I wrote, which has been getting updated every time I appear on something new. Should be a few updates this week, hopefully. And I was talking to Craig about the 12-minute writing practice being the longest practice I'd ever had, the longest thing I'd set out to do and kept doing. And it's not quite true. I mean, it is in some ways, because it was quite an active decision. I am going to write an article every week, and again, listen to the Starting a Blog Origin of the 12-Minute Method episode, or read the page on my website, or buy one of the books to get that story in full. So in some ways that is because I set out to do a thing, and then I kept doing it, and now I've been doing it for more than 6 years. But I've had a habit of exercising for longer than that. And so I'm going to talk about that today in this episode. But before I get to that, I'm going to talk a little bit about my reflections from listening back to episode 7, which for those who haven't listened to it yet, I recommend listening to it. In some ways, it felt one of the, freshest and most insightful episodes for me, because there was new insight created for me as I was doing it. And that often happens in these episodes, but I haven't reflected on that way in these weekly conversations that I have with my brother, in the same way that I have reflected on some of the other things I'm talking about in these episodes before. So the things that stood out for me, first of all, was this distinction that I kind of made but didn't talk about in episode 7, which is the distinction between a commitment and a promise. And I kept talking about the promises we make. This is reflecting back on the episode before that about getting married, on the impact of the promise we make. But I once, I heard, I think it was Fred Kaufman, the author, talking about promise, and how really, like any action that we take, we set ourselves, we should treat it as though it's a promise that we're making to ourselves and to our coach. He's talking about coaching, and when I heard him talk about it. And I once had this with a client whose English was not the language she'd spoken growing up. And the language she'd spoken growing up had commitment had a really different connotation to promise. So switching to promise made things really feel differently for her. And I think that distinction between commitment and promise is really important. I've got on my list to write a 12-minute article at some point about only saying we'll do things we're going to do, and then doing all the things we say we'll do. And essentially that is, I've just realized, about making promises, and only making promises about the things we're going to do. So not doing any, I'm going to try and do this, just I promise I'll do this, and then keeping our promises. So that's one thing I wanted to highlight. In some ways, I think this was the first episode that I really started talking about mortality. I said, we will die, and therefore, how shall we live? And don't avoid that idea. And that's a really important idea for me. I wrote about it in still the 12-minute blog, which has been read the most. It'll be in How to Create the Conditions for Great Work. I think it'll be chapter 1. But you can find it by Googling It's Time for You to Die. It's got some Fred Kaufman references who I mentioned already. And I mentioned really briefly at the end of the last episode about turning the things we'd be sad about at the end of our lives into commitments to live into. And you can find a bit more about that in that episode. In that article, It's Time for You to Die, which you can find on my website. But just best Google It's Time for You to Die, Robbie Swale, and you should find it. I also made this really sort of off-the-cuff thing that my brother and I had created a 12-minute method for connecting with each other. It's worth saying these calls that we have, Ewan and I, weekly are an hour long. And that's a really important thing about the 12-minute method. 12 minutes is really arbitrary. The train journey that it came from is rarely 12 minutes, just happens at the time I checked it. I only discovered this years later. It just happened at the time I checked how long it was 12 minutes, but that's great. Like the 12-minute method doesn't have to be a 12-minute long thing, although 12 minutes happens to be a good amount of time for a lot of tasks that we do, like writing, like emails. In fact, it's probably too long for emails. Don't spend 12 minutes on an email. 12 minutes, 60 minutes. And that came like through in some ways in other parts of the episode where I'm thinking like, what is enough? And 60 minutes a week is enough time for me and my brother to connect in a way that most people don't. And again, it's the power from the 12-minute method. This is where I learned that, but it's here as well in that story of my brother and I speaking weekly for an hour. It's like the power in a relatively small amount of time. 60 minutes once a week is incredible. I've talked to my brother about it this morning briefly in our weekly call. I'm recording this on a Tuesday. He said he thinks it's 10x the amount of time we spend speaking to each other. Actually, me reflecting now, is probably, like, if you take out shared time where we're all together with the family, it's probably more than that. It's extraordinarily larger amount of time done 1 hour a week. Just like 12 minutes a week, you can write a surprising amount. A surprisingly small amount of time is enough for me writing most of the time. Another thing that stood out from that episode, thinking back, was be careful when you're messing with a habit. Maybe I'll talk about that a little bit in this episode, talking about exercise. I wrote about this in one of my books or in one of my blogs. I mentioned it last time. Resistance can't cope with discipline. It can't cope with regularity. It can't cope with habits. It thrives in those moments where a habit is disrupted. When we get ill or we get injured or we just take a week off for some reason and we don't come back to it. And the longer you leave it, the less likely it is you come back. And that really nice thing that came out in that episode, I can't remember if I'd spoken about this before or where I thought about it, but doing a good thing in one part of your life makes it more likely that you'll do something similar to that good thing in other parts of your life. I think that's the 12-minute lesson for me. That's a lot of what this series of podcasts is about. It's like, if you start doing a good thing that you can feel is a good thing in one part of your life, then you might well find yourself doing it in other parts too. And then the last thing is, which we'll definitely come back to in this episode, being the person who does the thing. Once you can get past that, in my experience, it takes 2 or 3 years to become someone who writes, or in you and my case, to become brothers who speak every week. Once you've become that, that's the default thing. It's almost harder to stop doing it than to keep doing it. And I think that's a really important thing to know when you're starting out, because at the start, a habit can feel really, really hard. And then later, it gets a lot easier, and it becomes almost easier to do it than to not do it. And that's really important to know. So I'm going to talk about exercise today. Here's the timer. Off we go. So my memory of so I've exercised in my life at different times in different ways. School, I liked PE, but I wasn't fantastic at it. I played football for the school, but only just. I didn't really do any sports outside of school. I really enjoyed it always, though. And then I went to university, and, this is kind of classic. We stopped doing things that we liked. Like, why did I stop it? Well, I just felt a bit scared of what would happen if I went to the football club. It didn't quite fit. I'd never been to a football club. I'd just done PE at school. I didn't know that by the time you got down to UCL's 7th team, which I would have been probably lucky to get in, it was probably a really relaxed place and just a lot of fun. But I didn't know that, and I was afraid, and so I didn't do it. And I met a guy on a train once who ran the Skillless Soccer Society at UCL. And I thought, I'll do this next term. And then the society had disappeared by then. If you're listening, I'm sorry that we never stayed in touch, because we had a lot of fun. We randomly met on a train, had a great long conversation going either back to the north or back down from the north. And basically I didn't do I've never played organised sport again since. Until things started to shift more recently, and I really started to understand one of the key lessons of my adult life, which is practice. That everything is practice, like far more than we think is practice. Maybe I'll come back to that in another episode, but just really briefly, I read the book Bounce by Matthew Syed. There are other books. I think The Talent Code is one which tells similar stories. That basically we just vastly overestimate the impact of talent. Malcolm Gladwell wrote about it in Outliers as well. And grossly underestimate the impact of practice. And a lot of the time, what we think of as talent is just someone who's practiced an extraordinary amount by this time. So there are things like football that I just thought, I'm just not good at this. Music early on, I had the same thing with. And exercise was kind of one of those things. In the back of my mind, I still have this. In the back of my mind, I'd love to play football. But it's just like the activation energy of me playing football on a regular basis is so high. And so that's quite, It's not that it's not possible to do. And hopefully if we move house, which we're in the process of maybe doing, I'll look out for another way to do this again. But there are other sports for sure and other ways of exercise that have a much lower activation energy. We talked about that in a couple of episodes ago. And I did some running with my friend Russ around York. That got to a reasonably regular thing at one point, but I think I'd come out of that. And honestly, I think exercise is quite often catalyzed for people by some level of vanity. For me, I had someone say something a bit pretty mean to me about how I looked. I'd put on weight again. So I put on some weight after university. Immediately after that, I kind of lost it. And then I lost some of it. I think I ran a bit when I was living at home when I was about 22. And then I ran again, when I was with Russ quite a bit. We got into a good habit. A running partner again. Think about me buying an engagement ring, right? Have a partner who also does it so you can kind of catalyze each other's running. And then also it's a lot more fun and it's harder to drop out at the last minute. But someone said something mean to me. And then in a period of change in my life, I started doing exercise again. I started running. I started doing some other exercise, some kind of, what do you call it? Like body weight, press-ups, sit-ups, that kind of thing. And I can't remember exactly when this happened, but I think I gradually started exercising in the mornings. I think a lot of this happened actually. So I used to run in the evenings, definitely when I lived in Yorkshire. That was when I mostly did it. But my memory is something like this happened. Like I remember doing a quite boring job about 8 years ago. And there were lots of things to love about that job, and I loved the people, and I'm still friends with lots of them. But it wasn't using all of my talents. Again, if we think back, it was a transition job, and then I found it quite boring. And then I noticed one day I went for a run for some reason before work one day. I wish I could remember why that was, and I noticed that the work was a lot less boring that day. And then a few weeks later, when I went for a run in the morning, I noticed the same thing happen again. And this makes total sense to me. You don't have to go very far to find out, to have people tell you that if you do exercise, it's good for your mental health. It's good for all kinds of things. I'd listened to an interview with Tony Schwartz from the Energy Project talking about physical energy as well as mental and emotional and spiritual energy. I'll try and put a link to that, or to an article I've written about that in the show notes. And so it should be no surprise. And yet it took the actual evidence, like, oh, my life will be better if I do this. I will feel more energized and happy in work if I can find a way to exercise every morning. And so gradually I grew that habit. And I would definitely do running a couple of times a week. I think I probably knew that overrunning was a bad thing. And then I would do other exercise in the mornings when I could. And I would get injured sometimes, and so I would have to learn to stretch a bit more. I would kind of pull muscles in my back when running and that kind of thing because I was doing it right first thing in the morning. So definitely think about doing enough stretching. But I got into that habit of being someone who exercises in the morning. And again, in Create the Conditions for Great Work, that'll come out soon. That'll be the third 12-minute method book. There's a chapter in there which people really like called I wrote a chapter about my morning routine called How I Work Through Sadness and Fragility in the Morning. So again, if you Google How I Work Through Sadness and Fragility in the Morning, I'll try and remember to put that in the show notes as well. And Robbie Swale, you'll find it, and it'll be in that book. And it really did feel like it was about that for me. It was so that instead of feeling miserable in the morning, I was doing some things that helped me feel really good. And exercise was a big part of that. And over time, that practice evolved. Like my knees started to hurt, despite having good, decent running shoes, and other little injuries. I changed up a little bit what I did. I joined a gym nearby when that opened, and had a cheap offer and started going there so I could use some of the machines which were less pressure on my knees. I read a Tim Ferriss book, The 4-Hour Body, at some point. So, but this is all a bit, so there's two things actually. Maybe let's slow this down. So, one thing was I became someone who exercised in the morning, and there were all kinds of things that I had to get through to do that. Like when Emma and I moved in together, I was like really embarrassed to exercise in front of her or for her to see me exercising. I tried to do it when I could shut the living room door and she wouldn't come through. And it was a really strange thing, which when I think about that retrospectively, but this is a part of like why we don't do things, right? I was embarrassed. What if I'm doing press-ups and I look weird? What if like someone sees me sweating? All these reasons that we don't go to the gym, and the gym is a bit scary. Like, And it was so weird. And when in the end I kind of let her in, or she saw me doing it, of course it was fine. And she liked that I was doing exercise. She thought that was admirable. I had a client where I told that story once, and she was like, oh, yeah, of course my boyfriend won't mind seeing me meditate. Of course he won't. But it's like, for some reason, we don't feel like that's the case. Or I didn't, and she didn't. So there was that I had to get through. I had to get through injury, right? I had to work out, how do I stretch my back enough so I don't injure myself running? And then I had to deal with the problem of getting injured, which is, again, that classic thing. Be careful when you're messing with a habit. If I can't run, and running hits a lot of the energy projects things. It hits mental energy because you get time by yourself. It hits time in nature or outside. Often that connects you to something bigger, so it's spiritual energy. So there's a lot going on there as well as the physical energy. And I don't like the cross trainer at the gym as much as running, but I didn't want the exercise habit to end because I knew why I was doing it. I guess that's another habit piece. If you're connected to the why, which for me was a very clear day-to-day, will I enjoy my life more thing. And a big important thing for me is enjoying my life. Then as I started to do coaching, I realized looking after my energy, like I'm selling my presence basically. So I need to look after my energy. If I'm not looking after my energy, I'm not doing as much great work. So it then became a lot about that. And then over time, some interesting things happened, like things when I want to, I wanted to get better at exercising. In the end, it was like, so I thought I was talking to a client recently about exercise, and one way of looking at it is the 12-minute method way, right? Much better that I'm doing something every work morning. So that was where I drew my exercise commitment these days is very clear for me. I'm going to do some exercise every morning on a work day. So that was 5 days a week. Now it's 4 days a week because I spend a day with my daughter. That was the commitment. And that's the thing that I've become. I've become someone who exercises on work days. It'll be really hard to get that out of me now unless I choose to. And Emma understands that. And so, a time when that could have got really disrupted is when we had the baby, and it did get disrupted. I'm hugely grateful to Emma for helping me protect that. And I've had to really change my morning routine since that article because, of course, there's a little baby that needs looking after. Someone needs to take her to nursery, all these things. But I've built that in, and we're lucky that we've been able to build a routine for Leah in that works for her and allows me to do that. And it'll change again when we move house. All these things disrupt the habit. But I am now someone who exercises on every work day. And that will take quite a long time, I think, to get out of me. And I will have to really choose to let it go because it's so ingrained in who I am and what I do. And I feel the results of it so much. I've actually managed to play with feeling sad and fragile in the morning. And I don't think I do that as much anymore, thanks to a really amazing intervention on an episode of the Two Coach Confidence podcast that I was on. I think it was the second time I was on that. And Adam, who's one of the hosts, said this beautiful thing to me about practicing being sad in the morning. And could I change that? I have worked on that, but still the exercise helps me feel good. And also I know that in the future, I'll be really glad I've done it, right? That's another way to think about a habit to create in the 12-minute method. In 10 years, I'll be really glad. I'm already glad that I've been exercising every morning for 8 years. It's much better. And again, it's not as perfect in some ways as me playing football every week, which I'd love to do, but it's much better than doing nothing. And if I was to start playing football, I'd be really glad I've been exercising every day that I work for the last 8 years, or maybe it's a little longer than that, because it won't be so painful if I were to start playing football. And I have done some team sport in the meantime. So it's definitely any exercise, whether it's 5 minutes of stretching, just again, in 10 years, you will have been doing 5 minutes of stretching every morning for 10 years. And that's not nothing. For me, I've been exercising every workday morning for 8 years. That's got to be helping. And then it's worth thinking about upgrading a habit. That's what's happened with my exercise. I've tried a few times in different ways, reading The 4-Hour Body, like I mentioned before, getting some help from my friend Paul Thompson, who runs an amazing health and wellbeing business in the northwest of England, called Work Smart Wellbeing, and with a subpart called PT Health Coaching. Check them out. These days, my exercises, I mostly do 2 HIIT sessions a week from Paul's YouTube channel, from the PT Health Coaching YouTube channel. And I do 2 days in the gym, mostly on the cross trainer. It's not the best exercise habit I've done. That was definitely pre-Leah, post-lockdown, when I got into a really good place with some help from Paul, doing some resistance training. I was eating really well. I got definitely built up some muscle at that point. I was feeling really good. That's much harder now, that since Leah's been born and just finding the time and working 4 days a week. Some of that's excuses, but I've maintained the habit, so I feel happy with that. And I think when we move, I'm going to try and reshuffle that habit to get the get the resistance, the weights back in. There's the timer. So that doesn't feel quite as organized, but let me just slow it down before I finish. So key lessons from this one for me are becoming someone who exercises every whatever, and knowing that doing some exercise is good for me today, and it'll be really good for me in the long term as long as I look after myself. And then when I started to understand about practice, that really freed me up with exercise. I think in almost like I've been held back with exercise, I'm just seeing in this moment more than almost anywhere else, by feeling like I wasn't talented. Like the part of my life that I wish I'd known that practice made a difference would have been football early on. I would have practiced more. I would have gone to training, all that kind of thing. I would just had a lot more fun with it, been better and worried about it less, I think. And with exercise, it's held me back. Like I don't know how to do things. You know, I'm not good at whatever. I'm not flexible. Therefore, I can't do yoga. Like all these things. And then it turns, once I realized practice matters, then all the things about exercise that I'm doing feel more useful because I know they're going to be useful for the long term. So I'll be interested to listen back to that next time and pick up more lessons from that reflection. I feel like there's loads more in there I could have said about the exercising I've done. I've actually done an interview with Paul Thompson for his hopefully forthcoming podcast, which will come out at some point. So there's more about my exercise stuff in there. And of course, ask me, although I'm not an expert, I have learned quite a lot about exercise over the years. But the most important lesson I've learned is better to be doing some than to be waiting for the perfect time. It really feels like one of those lessons, a bit like the language learning episode as well. So I hope this helps you do something that you want to do, and particularly start exercising if you haven't been. Just remember, like, you of 10 years' time will be so glad. You of 3 years' time will be so glad you've been doing 5 minutes of stretch a day, or doing one Yoga with Adrian video a day. I got into Yoga with Adrian over lockdown when I got injured, actually. And again, I was looking for something else that I could do. Amazing YouTube channel by a super cool woman. Or 20 minutes of a HIIT session. Check out Tomo's. Like, there's loads of stuff out there that is really possible. I'll put a link to Paul and his work and his YouTube channel in the show notes as well. And I will see you next time. Okay, just a couple more things before you head out to whatever else you've got going on in the rest of your day. If you want to find out a bit more about me or sign up to my mailing list, you can do that at www.robbieswale.com. If you want to read the 12-Minute Method books, you can find out more about them on my website. You can find them on Amazon, and you can find them in lots of other bookshops and booksellers around the world. You might want to come and join the 12-Minute Method Facebook group. You can find that by searching for the 12-Minute Method on Facebook, or there's links on my website. And you can find some other people there who are interested in doing work that matters to them and finally doing the things that they want to do. You can find me on lots of social media platforms. I'm most active on LinkedIn, so you might want to find me there. And most of all, I'd love to hear from you, especially if something that I've made has inspired you to finally do something you've been meaning to do for a long time. Hearing those stories are some of the most meaningful things for me in my work. And so they help me keep going when I might want to give up. So I'd love to hear from you. But most of all, I'd love it if you did that thing that matters to you, that you've been meaning to do.